Hello and welcome to this Confluence special webinar. Today we're going to be decoding one of the biggest geopolitical events that's taken over the news, businesses in the Middle East at least, maybe even the world over. To help me do this is the CEO and founder of Confluence Consultants, Shraddha Bhandari. Hello, how are you?
Hi, Amandeep. I'm very good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. So on today's special webisode, we aim to break down the geopolitical developments to hopefully help us cut the clutter, which is a phrase that you've used, Shraddha, which I really enjoyed, and get through the speculation, get down to the facts of the matter. So on this segment, we're going to be focusing on the geopolitical landscape of the region, talk a little bit about the events that have been going through the past couple of weeks, and get into a little bit of an analysis of the risks for the region, aside from the big Iran question and how the GCC is going to be reacting to it. So, as I mentioned, one of the biggest questions for this region is about the escalation of the conflict and how that's going to be impacting states outside Palestine. One of the biggest actors involved in such an escalation would be Iran through its armed groups. So Shraddha, let's start with the foundational question. What is the axis of resistance and how has it impacted the region's geopolitical landscape so far?
Thank you, Amandeep. So that could easily take me a month to sort of decode. So in the interest of making it very simple, I'm going to do some stereotyping and generalizations. So essentially, the axis of resistance is something that Iran has built over the last sort of decades to counter the US and the Israeli might, as you might say, in this region, right? So these are proxy groups, armed groups that operate in different countries. And at one point of time, before Qasem Soleimani was taken out, they would surround each and every major power in the region, right? So Houthis in Yemen for Saudi Arabia, Hezbollah in Lebanon for Israel, then there are Syrian groups, and obviously Iraq, which is now for a long time, it was just a satellite of Iran. And so all of these groups and Hamas, obviously, in Palestine. So these are being funded militarily. Logistical support has been given, of course, moral support, as Iran keeps saying. And these form the axis of resistance, axis of evil is called by the Western powers. And they've managed to wreak a lot of havoc in the countries around, despite not being state actors, right? So obviously, some of them are now, but they did not start as state actors.
Right. So they have been called the axis of evil, and from their perspective, it does make sense because they have been causing a lot of dismantling. But what is the end game with this kind of presence everywhere and presence in Saudi as well, for example? So aside from the hegemonic battle in the region, what does an end game for Iran look like?
So this is where it gets very, very interesting. So yes, these are Iranian proxy groups, but they operate within a political, geopolitical context, right? So over the years, the political aims, for example, the armed aims of what these groups want to do have, in a sense, diverged from each other and from Iran as well to a certain extent. So I'll, for example, give you the example of the Hezbollah, for example. Hezbollah probably is the most closely aligned to Iran in terms of still coordinating with Iran on military. A lot of military support to Hezbollah comes from Iran. In fact, that's why the Syrian regime of President Bashar al-Assad is very, very important to Iran, because it's an overland for providing troops to Hezbollah, which then keeps Israel in check. But Hezbollah now, not now, actually, their first parliamentarians were elected all the way back in early 90s. Very few people reflect on the fact that Hezbollah is not just a military and armed organization anymore. It's a full-fledged political force in Lebanon, right? And over the years, they've done pretty well in elections. In fact, they were the kingmakers for the longest time. However, that position has been challenged since the 2019. So before, again, COVID happened and before Qasem Soleimani was killed, there were massive protests in Iraq and Lebanon, which were as targeted against the United States as they were against Iran. Right. So in 2022 elections in Lebanon, a lot of anti-establishment parties were questioning the entire establishment of Lebanon. Every elitist party, Lebanon has a power sharing agreement, right? So the prime minister generally is a Sunni Muslim. The president is a Christian Maronite, and the speaker of the parliament is generally a Shiite Muslim. And that's led to a lot of cronyism. So a lot of young people have been admitted to the parliament that are questioning the very basis of this entire system, right? So has been a shock to Hezbollah. And plus, as we all know, Lebanon economy has been really, really in doldrums. There was that massive explosion at the port. The currency has been in a free flow. There are capital controls. I think Hezbollah would think 4 times before getting a war to Lebanon, right? And that is where it's diverging from Iran in significant ways, because it also has a political constituency that it has to look at.
It has been posited several times in the news that Hezbollah is probably going to be playing an important part in opposition to Israel, joining forces with Hamas, potentially creating another angle of the conflict, another geographic area of the conflict as well. And like you said, there isn't any financial interest or a financial benefit in doing so. And then there's the other part of Iran as well, where they have said that there is no interest in being involved in the conflict directly because they weren't aware of Hamas's intent to attack on the 7th of October, so they can't be expected to be supportive in terms of being directly involved. But political and moral support will be provided. So how exactly do we see this panning out? It just seems like they do want to have their presence felt. Iran wants to have its presence felt, but also not quite be there. So how do we see that playing out?
So I think interestingly, Amandeep, when the October 7th attacks happened, I used to express views and people were like, no, escalation is going to happen. There's no other way around it, etc. I think there are 2 things that need to be taken into account. First is the political interests of the people who rule these countries, right? And then there is the larger public opinion, which is obviously very pro-Palestinian. So the Arab population, for example, that there have been an outburst of support everywhere from the region to the Western countries, etc. Most people believe that because of this Arab outpouring of support among the people, that these monarchies or these governments will be forced to ally against Israel, right? Again, as I've said, everybody has their own interest to play in the region. Hezbollah, as I've already said, is politically sort of constrained in what it can do, because any opening of the second front in a way that gets Israel into Lebanon, rather than just throwing rockets or having like massive clashes on the border, will definitely get the Lebanon government involved, because Hezbollah is a part of the government. For the Houthis, for example, any mention of Houthis puts the Saudis and the UAE on a radar. Now, so just to backtrack a bit, till 2019, in fact, 2022 was January when there was an alert that the Houthi missiles may target the Burj Khalifa, right? So there has always been this this threat of the Houthis reaching vital installations in Saudi Arabia. In fact, they managed to reach an oil facility, an oil tanker of Saudi Arabia. They came very close to the international airport in the city of Riyadh. So for the Houthis, any involvement of the Houthis in this will be a radar to KSA and UAE, which nobody definitely wants to get into the entire conflict. Then you obviously have the Syrian forces, but Syria and Iraq are in itself very complicated. You know, every power here is fighting one against the other, right? So there's obviously the Bashar al-Assad regime, and then there are pro-Iranian militias, but then there's the American bases, and then in terms of escalation, what I see is definitely as the Israeli ground invasion sort of increases, the casualties increase, there's going to be more popular outbursts, etc. But will that mean that these proxies will open another front? I don't think. Because very fundamentally, the Arab monarchies will not appreciate an Iranian-led proxy victory in the region. Yeah. You know, I think most people know this. Hamas is an offshoot of Muslim Brotherhood whose stated intent was to overthrow the Arab monarchies. A lot has changed in terms of rapprochement. Iran, Saudi have been talking to each other. Yemen was nearing a peace process. And also, I don't think the Houthis have been, since 1960s, they've been a marginalized group. They're this close to power, right? So they will be thinking twice before getting the Americans involved or they're getting the Israelis involved in a very significant way. So yeah, this is what I think in terms of like the escalation dynamics. Mm-hmm.
So in terms of actually resolving the conflict, obviously it doesn't seem like it's very close to us on the horizon. It seems like it's somewhere there, but getting to it seems like a very tricky process. We've all seen there've been updates about you know, the no-fly zone being rejected against the US and Israel. Any missiles being intercepted by the GCC as well. So it is clear that nobody actually wants an escalation. It's in nobody's interest to have an escalation, not even those who have the capacity to potentially deal with it. So in terms of resolution of the conflict, I know you've suggested the idea of a pan-Arab coalition before, where having this sort of alliance and actively putting the Palestinian interest forward, not forgetting about them, as you've well said, so that this kind of uprising doesn't happen again. That is what is needed. How do you think that would play out with Iran in the picture as well? Like you said, relations between Iran and Saudi have been better. Relations between Saudi and Israel were on the way to get there. So how do we see everybody working together for a diplomatic solution to this instead of a military solution? And how quickly do you think that will pace?
So I think everybody was scared that it would become one of those wars where nobody wants a regional escalation, but nobody really knows what else to do. So it's almost been about a month and a half now. Tempers have stayed like much cooler than what anybody would have expected. Yeah. So let's see, every time the Palestinians are cut off from a peace process, when the regional powers decide, oh, now we will decide what's going to happen to Palestine, there is something. And rightly so, there was the Camp David Accords, which led to the first Intifada, where, Egypt normalized relations with Israel. Jordan was on its way of normalizing relations. That led to the first Intifada. Then there were the Oslo Accords, which went to quite a bit of extent. And then obviously Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, etc. And then it deteriorated, leading to the second Intifada. Israel has always suffered in terms of these intifadas. It's like they don't know what to do with this popular Palestinian anger, right? And it's a very similar situation at the moment, because it's an untenable status quo. Hamas has gone and delivered the gravest level of insult. We don't know why it happened. Probably we're never going to know why it happened, what failed, but probably Israel was at its weakest politically. Geopolitically, it was in the strongest position, but 52 weeks of protest, a system that was collapsing, 5 elections in some 3 years, etc., etc. So I think that's what finally led to it. What would lead to a peace process? I mean, there was more of hope than how I see it happening. And pan-Arabism, I don't mean it in the sense of Nasser's pan-Arabism, for example. That's not given much to the region. I mean, in terms of, getting the Palestinians and the Israelis together face to face, realizing that there is really nothing else that can be done. They have to coexist with each other. Israel is here to stay. The Palestinian population has really sort of shot out, and they're not going, they should not go anywhere. Yeah. So I don't know. There is a hope that instead of becoming Israel's 9/11, it becomes Israel's Oslo or Camp David. Oslo, actually, Camp David was more with Egypt. So that's where, and also I'd like to point out that for me, US remains the only effective security broker in the region, however imperfect it might be, right? So I'm going to stop there and let you ask a follow-up question if there are any.
I would have been very surprised if you actually had a solution to that question, because politicians and diplomats have been going on for years and years. And then we find out that Shadab Bandari had the answer all along. So that would have been, that would have been very interesting. So I suppose I have one final question for you. Obviously, when we were thinking about how regional risks are going to be panning out at the end of last year, for example, how 2023 is going to look, nobody imagined that we're going to be looking at another Israel-Palestine or Israel-Hamas, just a picture that included the two of them in aggression. So how do you think this is going to look in 2024? Are we expecting this to continue like a Russia-Ukraine kind of elongated war? Are we expecting this to be over in a little while? What do you think 2024 looks like?
I think people in 2023 should have been able to see this, very honestly, and it's all on the geopolitical experts to do our analysis better. The last 2 years have been pretty eventful in the Israel-Palestinian history, even though Israel was normalizing relations with everybody, which was what was focused on. Tensions had been increasing, especially with the West Bank, with which a sort of status quoist peace had been made, right? So I think we should have anticipated something like this. Just to place it in the context of the global power rivalries, I think we've taken this stand at Confluence that, floodgates have been opened. So Russia-Ukraine was just the start, but the way the superpower rivalries are panning out, people around the world, not just with the support of superpowers, but they will also realize that their allies are busy somewhere else. And they can step up and do things which otherwise in the international community would not have been allowed. So we'll see a lot of these small conflicts erupting everywhere. So obviously there was Russia-Ukraine, then there was the season of coups in Africa, which everybody seems to have forgotten. Now it's Israel-Palestine. It's also the social media world, right? Everybody knows that after some time, these conflicts will be sort of forgotten and people will learn to live with it. Israel-Palestine is heading that way, unless, of course, as they say, that wars are easy to start, difficult to maintain, and notoriously hard to end. Israel doesn't have an end game. They can't rule Gaza. It's practically impossible. The Arab states are not what they used to be. So Fatah hasn't stepped up. I don't know what the option to Hamas is. These are all of the questions that will keep coming up. But I suspect it'll get worse before it gets better. The hostages will have to be released. Israeli public opinion will have to be assuaged. The Arab states will have to maintain their population. So I think they're doing it in their own way. UAE with its humanitarian aid, setting up the Pearl Peace Hospital, very clear denunciations of the Israeli action in Gaza, calling them disproportionate. But beyond that, the Jordanian economy is in doldrums, the Egyptian economy is in doldrums, Lebanon is suffering. For Saudi Arabia, for UAE, for the GCC countries, economic growth is very, very important. Neom is just kilometers away from the Saudi dream city, just away from the Israeli border. COP28 is happening in the UAE. So I think the regional escalation, everybody will try and minimize, including Iran. They don't want to put all their proxies in one egg basket sort of a thing, even though they've been talking about it for years. But we'll see, ebbing and flowing, and reactions to that, which I think the companies will need to be prepared for. They'll need to do their risk trigger analysis, where they're situated, where their employees are, their diversification plans, everything will need to be in order. And then, of course, there's the impact to energy and the larger sort of supply chains in the world.
Right. Thank you very much, Shraddha, for opening our eyes, as it were. It has been a rather grim month and a half, but it is important to break down the features of this conflict, the actors in this conflict, motivations, and see what the future could potentially look like. So thank you, Shraddha, for participating in this. And thank you to our viewers. And we hope to get back into a special episode when we have more interesting updates. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. We also do the scenario gaming exercise. So anybody needs more information, you can reach out to either of us here. Thank you.